question, feel free to put your virtual hand up and we will unmute you. And so you can do this by going to participants and then clicking the blue button. And if you'd like to ask a question, but you don't want to speak, you can message Serene or I your question privately and we'll ask it for you. And we also want to remind you that you can message anyone on the team with any questions you might have at all. And so they have TEDxUCSD in their name. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Richard. So Dr. Richard Shuster is a clinical psychologist with a specialty in forensic and neuropsychology. His talk discusses how surviving a car accident allowed him to realize his true purpose, which is to help others. He focuses on the neuroscience of altruism and how we can shift away from a society focused on selfies to the neurological benefits of helping others. So we want to thank you for being here with us. And now I'm going to pass it to Serene for our first question.
Awesome. So I guess our first question for you is, could you please talk us through your process of creating your talk? What was it like and what was the inspiration for it?
It's a good question, Serene. For me, this was sharing a lot of the story that I do share when I'm on other platforms, like other people's podcasts or the media. But I felt like of all the things that I wanted to talk about, especially with what's going on in the world right now, it was really important to highlight the science of why we need to help other people right now, because the world is hurting in so many different ways. So that was going to be my focus. And then once I knew that, it was all about being able to make it not overly nerdy, like there's some specific psychological and neurological things I left out of it, because this is not one of those boring lectures, right? TEDs are supposed to be fun and engaging. So I really kind of kept that in mind, but just wanted to convey my story and be in tune with your theme of rebooting while really highlighting the importance of doing kind things for other people right now in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially given, like you said, given the time that we are in right now, it's even more important to be involved and to be kind to others. I guess I have a follow-up question for that. And given the pandemic situation that we're in right now, how can I help, or how can I help given our limited ability? How can we help as a society?
That's an even better question than the first one, because it's something that everybody is probably thinking about. Obviously, we're not going to run into public places and do things like we used to, right? One of the things I used to do was I would always buy people's groceries in the grocery store, or buy their gas or pick up their Starbucks or something. And we don't really get to do that anymore because we're social distancing. But what we can do is, we have the power of the internet, we have the power of social media, and there's a lot of things about social media that are problematic, but there's a lot of really good things too. And as an example, there's somebody in my community here that started a little grassroots campaign just asking for donations of $10. We all probably can afford close to $10, right? And they were able to raise, this thing went viral, and they were able to raise $16,000 to provide meals for first responders who were working round the clock for basically days at a time. And so a small gesture can grow into a really big one. And that's something that I would encourage everybody to do, is find those opportunities. They're all over Facebook. You can start there. And another thing that I would say is, even within our own worlds, our own circles and our friends and families, probably everybody can name just off the top of their head maybe 3 or 4 people that mean a lot to them that they haven't connected with in a really long time. Maybe it's a cousin or an aunt or just an old friend. So one of the things I did when I knew I wasn't leaving my house for a really long time, in no particular order, was I made a list of people who really mean a lot to me that I haven't talked to in at least 6 months. And I've been reaching out to them every week. And then sometimes it's just a little text. Hey, we haven't talked in a while, thinking about you. And sometimes it's a phone call, but it's something that we could all do. And that doesn't cost anybody anything. So those are a couple things that are top of mind for me.
No, absolutely. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the relationships that you have with other people make such a big difference, not only to you, but to them. And it's also important to start small and then grow from there, for sure. So I'll pass it along to Scott to ask our next question.
Well, I was actually going to ask a follow-up to that. How do you kind of find the courage to reach out to people who you haven't necessarily talked to in a really long time?
So I guess that's a little bit of a loaded question, Scott, in that are we not, if it's somebody you haven't talked to because you stole their girlfriend, that's a little different. You know, if it's just a relationship that due to the stress and the pressures and the times of life, we all have so much we have to do, whether, you know, it's finals or whether it's our jobs or whatever it is, life gets in the way, I think, of relationships. And so, you know, you see and talk to the people and continue to engage those people that are in your face, whether they're literally in your face or they're in your face because they're the ones that are in your messenger feeds and you're the most, right? So regarding courage, what I would say is that if you feel bad that you haven't talked to somebody that you had a good relationship with in a long time, you know, it's probably maybe easier to reach out via a text or an email than it would be via a call or FaceTime, and just say, hey, you know, this coronavirus is really crazy, and you know, it's wild how we've all had a chance to kind of take a step back and slow down and focus on stuff that's really important. And I just, you know, really want to let you know that you're somebody that matters to me, and I know that we haven't been in touch in a while, but I want to let you know that you're important to me, and I'd love to hop on a call and catch up. And I think that's probably enough. And if they get back with you, you're good. If they don't, you don't have to have an awkward confrontation. But I think most people understand, Scott. And I think that, you know, there are some people, and what's one of the things that's been interesting is that for me, a lot of people that I haven't really talked to in a really long time, we've been able to kind of pick up that baton, just like we had a conversation last week, you know? So if there are people in your life that are important to you and that's mutual, it'll probably be the same for you as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for just kind of maintaining relationships. And I guess like in the same kind of vein of advice, what would you kind of tell your college age self if you had to give yourself advice?
Oh God, I mean, yeah, my college age self, it was a really good example. I stayed up one night. It was my 21st birthday, and all of my friends were like, come on, we got to go to the bar. And they wanted me to go, and they had a night planned for me, and I chose not to. Unfortunately for me, being a December birthday, my birthday was always during finals week. So I opted to stay and study for that final. And I did good, you know, I did okay on the final. But I realized that was an experience. Like turning 21, you only turn 21 once. And I chose to miss out on that experience for the sake of, you know, getting a slightly better grade. And so I would probably tell my college self, because college is the best. If you're listening to this, you're in college, so you know this is true. What you might not realize is that there is going to be no time in your life more freeing and devoid of pressure. I know there's academic pressure, but in terms of life pressure, than college. So what I would have told myself was to really focus on as many experiences as I could that were fun, because you honestly have the rest of your life to figure it out. And, you know, college is a time about really finding out important parts of who you are. I know that things change over time with what's important to us, but college is a time to really explore those parts of you, and you get that through experiences. So I'm not telling people listening to this not to study for your finals, but have that balance and enjoy the experiences that life can throw at you.
I think that's a really good advice. It can definitely be hard in college to kind of like have that perspective and to kind of just enjoy it, but it's definitely helpful to hear. I'm going to pass it to Serene for another question.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess following off of that, what are some tips you have for individuals, particularly college students, who are trying to understand or look for their purpose?
I think part of the challenge in today's society, and particularly in the generations of millennials and Gen Z, is that your generation is so focused on purpose and social good, right? Like people who are your age that come out of college and go into the workplace, they don't really want to work for a company that isn't oriented towards making society better. That's very different than it was 20 years ago, when nobody cared about it at all. It was just, you know, you got out and you got a job and tried to make as much money as possible. So I think people that are your age put extra pressure on themselves to know Like, what am I supposed to be doing in the world? Like, 'cause it's all around you. Like, we all hear these messages. My whole TED talk, right? Like, I talked for almost 11 minutes about doing good. And so that can put too much pressure on you if you haven't figured out your sense of purpose. When I do these activities, when I'm on stage and I have, not 10 minutes, but I have 45 minutes to an hour, I walk people through an exercise. It's almost a kind of hypnosis where, and I'm not going to do it now, but basically what I have them do is go into this deep breathing and this sort of trance-like state where it's a visualization exercise where they just focus on that thing that brings them the greatest amount of joy. Because what brings you joy and what brings you passion and what you would do for free but could get paid for maybe in the real world, that's a really good start to finding your purpose. For me, it evolved over a course of years, right? The accident was the flashpoint that started it, but then it was over the next number of years where it really evolved. The accident was in my early 20s, and then the rest of that stuff didn't really evolve for almost 10 years in some instances. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule that says you have to know, but what you probably need to be clear on are what your values are, because purpose and values are very intrinsically connected together. And so if you are very clear on what matters to you, what you stand for, and additionally what upsets you and what you're against, when you know those things, then you've already eliminated a lot of the pieces, because it's kind of like an old flow chart where it'd be like, if the answer is yes, you go this way, and if it's no, you go that way, and then you can kind of drill down and figure those things out. So again, to really quickly summarize, get very clear on your values, and you can just simply write those down. Just get it with a piece of paper and a pen and start writing down the things that matter to you as a human being, and then start focusing on those things that are fun for you. It's really, really super fun. They get you excited. You want to tell people about them. And then when you graduate, if you're able to find a way to kind of combine those two, that's the chocolate and peanut butter. Like they're good by themselves, but together it's like it's a Reese's peanut butter cup, and it's awesome.
Absolutely. I think it's really important, like you said, to keep in mind what your values are. And then when you're lost and when you're not sure what your purpose is, to go back to the roots of that and back to what you stand for. I completely agree with that. Just another follow-up question, because you mentioned how in your talk and just recently now, how the accident kind of shaped you in finding your purpose and how you're finding your passion. So the question I have for you is, how different do you think your life would have been had the accident not happened?
Oh God, I'd be slightly taller. I'd be like an eighth of an inch taller, I think. That's really an interesting question. There was this movie, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was basically this couple was supposed to fall in love, and somehow they got in this alternate timeline, and ultimately they found each other in the end, even though the circumstances were different. We are shaped by our experiences. So, what that accident did for me was really focus on what a jerk I was being, and how I was so heavily focused on all the wrong stuff. A moment like that, you guys are in San Diego, so you really don't have hurricanes in San Diego, I don't believe, but you have earthquakes. But with a hurricane, basically what happens is you turn on the Weather Channel and you know it's coming, and then you have X amount of time to get out of town. And in that moment, of all the stuff in your home that you own, you have to evaluate what's really important. What do you get to bring with you, and what do you have to leave behind, and what are you okay leaving behind? So in that accident, for me, what that was kind of like was my hurricane, except I didn't have warning. It was quick. But I started really rapidly in that moment focusing on, okay, so cool, the watch I'm wearing, this isn't going into the grave with me. This car is about to be totally destroyed. So in that moment, I realized that the material stuff didn't matter as much. And so that is what started that for me. I, honest to God, Serene, have no idea what I would be doing if not for that accident, because it radically shifted my life. I guess I probably would have kept working at that job, that a company I started. I would have eventually become unfulfilled, but not know why. And then would have had to figure out something else to do. But I would have lacked that connection to meaning. I would have just been like, man, this sucks. I don't want to do it anymore. But I wouldn't have been able to draw back to that experience. So I don't know. I mean, I'm glad, you know, in hindsight that it happened, because it changed my life ultimately in a really good way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely difficult to tell what direction your life would have gone had that not happened. I think Scott has a couple of questions lined up for us, so I'll let him take over.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions from the audience. So Olivia asks, how do you kind of respond to people who take advantage of your kindness?
That's a really great question, Olivia. And this actually happened to me in a big way not that long ago. I recently launched a software company and was using somebody that I trusted, and they were a shark and nearly destroyed that company. And now I got rid of them, and I had to get lawyers, and it was ugly. But out of that, I realized, I was way too trusting with this individual, and it was because they were in a community where I trusted other people. So it becomes a question of, how do you go on after that, and do you become jaded, or do you trust people? And I would say, Olivia, there are always people in this world that are going to take advantage of others. It's been around since the end of as long as humans have been able to walk and talk and do all that we do. There have been people that are manipulative, and this is not a commentary on good versus evil necessarily, but just for whatever reasons, whether it's for their own survival, or this is how they raised, or they don't know any different, people will take advantage of others. I think that if we allow people to take it, people can take advantage of kindness. So the answer, I guess, to your question is, it's happened to me before. I hope that it doesn't happen again, but it might. And if it does, I guess my reaction to it when it happened the last time was to just completely forgive that person and just move on. And so if we don't do that, if we allow ourselves to become, what's the expression, gun shy? That's not the right expression. But
like resentful?
Resentful, but I think fearful is where I was going. If we become kind of too afraid because of past experiences to help that next person, then we're doing ourselves and society a disservice. So I think, you can't go around waving $2,000 in each hand in a dangerous part of a city and expect something not to happen to you, probably. But I think there can be some judgment, but I also think that we need to be really open to the fact that the more good we put out, the more good will come back. And even though there are going to be some people that either seek to take advantage of that or don't agree with that, if we have more people doing good than we have doing bad, then we're winning.
Yeah, I think you just kind of have to believe in the pursuit of it. And if people try to take advantage, just kind of keep moving forward. I'm going to pass it to Serene for another audience question that we have.
Okay.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Stephanie, who says, what's been the biggest challenge throughout your time as a psychologist, keynote speaker, and as a president of Every Kid Rocks, and how have you overcome this challenge?
Great question, Stephanie. Thank you for asking that. Honestly, the biggest challenge that I have is time. And what has become and so there's time, different elements of time that impact me. So one, there's time as it relates to these businesses. And then there's time as it relates to me being a dad, because I have two awesome young boys. And then there's time as it relates to me being a husband. And so if I'm not good at balancing all three of those, then one will suffer. And so that's what's so challenging about being an entrepreneur, especially in the beginning, is that you have to be able to figure out, where do I say no? And saying no is hard. We're not accustomed. We get uncomfortable when we say no to people. And so I've had a mentor tell me something really cool, which has been helpful. And that's, number one, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no. Meaning that if you're not really excited about, what opportunities are put in front of you, then say no. And, the more I've done stuff like this, and the more I've been in the media, the more people are, always reaching out to me. Oh, I want to be on your show, or can I pick your brain for an hour, which is code for, can I have consultation for free for whatever. And so a really cool thing, that kind of a script that I wrote, because I don't want to hurt people's feelings, but I also want to protect the integrity of my time and my boundaries, is that I tell people that I'm really, I really appreciate that. That's so thoughtful of you to consider me. I'm very much in the weeds working on whatever X is at the time. And, when I do something, I throw 100% of myself into it. And it wouldn't be fair to whoever is involved with X if I kind of took myself away from that. But thank you so much. And, I just really need to focus on these commitments that I've already made to people. And when you say it that way, you're basically saying, no, I can't, spend that extra time or give you that time, but you're doing it in a way that's respectful. Because that's, we want to be respectful. But so in terms of challenges, Stephanie, for me, it's balancing the time between all of the responsibilities that I have to do.
I think that's great advice, because learning how to say no is definitely a very hard skill. I think that I personally can relate to that. But it is for sure important to know when to say no and when to take care of yourself first. We have another question from my mother, actually, who is asking, what's your take on the mainstream view of nice people finish last?
I think it's an expression. I have never actually looked at scientific research to see if there's any validity to that. Although I will tell you that I've been privileged to, especially through my podcast, connect with, over 150, the world's top selling authors, athletes, philanthropists. And I can say that all of these are really, really nice people, and they're all really successful. So, something's really only true if you believe it's true, I would say. And in fact, I had somebody tell me who's in the mental health space, wanted to be. They were a student, they were going to go to graduate school, and they wanted to be a therapist. They said, well, I want to be a therapist, but therapists don't make any money. And I just said, what do you mean? And they said, well, everybody knows that. And I just said, that's, there's no science behind that. So if we're already setting ourselves up for the mindset, that, if we're going to be nice, that we're going to finish last, or we won't be successful, or if I do something helping, like something helpful that won't benefit anybody, like you've already kind of started pre-programming. And this is a whole nother neuro discussion, but there's a ton of research on stuff like this. They've done really cool research where they've done it in sports. One of my favorite, I guess I am going to get a little neuro on you guys. One of my favorite studies was when this was a study on two high school basketball teams. And, there was no future Michael Jordan or LeBron on either of these teams. These were just normal kids that really weren't going to go on and play in college or the pros. And they had one team that what they did was they made them close their eyes and visualize that they were going to hit their free throws successfully before the game. Like they really focused and saw themselves perfectly nailing those free throws. They didn't do that with the other team. Consistently, repeatedly, over and over again, the team that visualized hitting those free throws nailed an overwhelmingly larger percentage of free throws. So what that shows us is that mindset is an enormous component of how we carry ourselves in the world. And so to people who say nice guys finish last, I would say that's just an old antiquated expression. We know different.
So you were starting to kind of bring up the science, and we got a lot of questions about kind of like, how do you think we can teach this message to younger audiences who might not necessarily have the same level of appreciation for the science?
I almost think you don't even need to know the science. It's kind of like, I don't know, a professor once talking about short time-limited therapy, where you don't necessarily need to understand. The expression is grab the head and the guts will follow. And so, I think what's really important is not that everybody can regurgitate which parts of the brains and neurotransmitters are involved in this sort of stuff, but just rather philosophically that, you know, when we do acts of kindness, when we do good for others, that feels good. And so, you know, for younger people, I would say it's probably an easier sell than for older people, because again, you know, the research is bearing out as you look at the different generations. You know, Gen X really wasn't that way. Certainly the boomers were absolutely not this way. But, you know, as you're getting into the millennials and Gen Z, there's an overwhelming need to feel social responsibility and that you're contributing in some way. So young people are already halfway there. They want to do something that contributes. So I think if you say, hey, you know, like, we want to do something good, and you know, there's this doctor guy who's talking about it, go watch his TED Talk. But yeah, I think that the actual hard science is less important than, you know, just being able to convey the message. Because once you start, and it's not like you can't prove it, like, go out there, and this is something at the end of every episode of my podcast, I tell my audience as my call to action: do something kind for somebody else and post it in their social media feeds, because the happiest people are those that help others. So once you try it, you know, I've never talked to anybody, nor have I seen any research that says, you're a liar, Dr. Richard. I did something kind for somebody else and I felt terrible. Like, doesn't work that way. You know, so whether you understand the biology or not, you can understand that you feel good if you do something kind for somebody else. And I think that's the message. And I think that's really the only message that absolutely needs to be conveyed.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's a phrase called citizen scientist, which kind of conveys what you're talking about, where you don't necessarily need to know all of the science in order to want to help and want to be a part of the social change. So we've got another audience question from Coco, and she's asking, has your purpose changed since the beginning? And if not, what kept you motivated to work toward that purpose? If so, how has it changed?
That's a cool question, Coco. I mean, certainly before my accident, my purpose in my mind was to drive as much revenue as humanly possible and be like Uncle Scrooge in the money pit, DuckTales, and that was my goal. Now I recognize that might be a generation too old of a reference, but my purpose as it shifted, you know, is really, I mean, I have a mantra essentially, and my mission statement, so to speak, is to help other people become the best versions of themselves, even if it's of no direct benefit to me. That's my mission, period. And that's been my mission for a really long time. And so I'm doing a lot of things that are completely different from each other. What I'm doing with Every Kid Rocks couldn't be more dissimilar than what I'm doing with my psychological assessment company, which couldn't be more dissimilar than my podcast. I guess speaking and podcasting are a little bit similar, but they're all these kind of different vehicles. And so what's cool is that from a connectedness standpoint, they all can connect directly back to that mission. And so that's where it goes back to what I was talking about earlier with values, because what your specific focus might be at that time, like it might be to create a website that, you know, helps puppies, I don't know, whatever it is at the time, like that can change and that will shift over time. But your values, which are just very intrinsically aligned and connected to purpose, those things tend to remain, for the most part, static over the course of a lifetime. They can change, like anything can change, but you know, like if you think killing somebody is wrong, you're not likely 20 years later to think killing somebody is okay, right? Like those things tend to stay pretty static in a lot of ways. Great question.
We have another audience question from Sabrina, who asks, for people who put all their passions and succeeding mindset into what they do and then fail, how can they kind of bounce back from that experience / learn to find some positive outcome of that situation?
So there's a really great book, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember the author's name right now, but it's called Failing Forward. And you know, you can give it your all and do the best you can, and things still not work out. And that doesn't mean that it's your fault or that there's anything, it's just circumstances, right? And so I think failure is awesome. So I would, I know that sounds unusual, but I think some of the best changes I've made in my life and the best lessons have come from failure. And so I've heard this from many, many successful people that I've interviewed who are, achieving unbelievable things in the world, that out of failure comes success. Where it's dangerous is if you choose to fail, but then not learn anything from it. Failure doesn't, maybe it is your fault that you failed, or maybe it's not, but there's always lessons to be learned in setbacks, always. And I'm very introspective with things that have gone wrong so that I can learn from them and try and do things differently. Doesn't mean that it'll work out the way I envisioned it when I do it differently, but at least then you don't get into this pattern of repeating mistakes. In psychology, we have a term known as an external locus of control. That's not the type of person you want to be. And if somebody with an external locus of control sees the world as just happening to them and they're powerless to do anything about it, where we want to be is where we have what's known as an internal locus of control, where we basically say, I control myself, I control the way I think, I control the way I feel, and we can't control the weather, and we can't control when there's going to be earthquakes or, killer viruses or, giant sea creatures coming out of the ocean. We can't control any of that stuff. But when you have an internal locus of control, it allows you to feel like you have ownership of your life, and you feel empowered to make changes after those setbacks. Great question. Awesome question.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a personal, follow-up question for you. Because your entire job and your entire purpose, like you've mentioned multiple times, is helping other people, do you ever get discouraged or unmotivated if you see that all of the work that you're putting in isn't helping a particular individual or a group of individuals?
That's a really good question. There's metrics, obviously, with some of the stuff. So like with my charity, it's numbers, right? Like we know X number of donations equals X number of kids that I'm able to help. So that's tangible. Like with my podcast, it's totally intangible. I know I can go online and I can see how many people downloaded an episode in a given week, but I have no idea if that made any kind of, what kind of impact did that make? Because there aren't thousands of people who are sending me messages after every episode, nor do they for like most podcasters, right? Like, it's out there, it's expected to be consumed. I don't really know the impact specifically, but what I do know is that there are going to be ripple effects. I mentioned very, very briefly at the end of my TEDx, I talked about a young man who had reached out to me because he heard my story on a podcast. He decided to not commit suicide. I had absolutely, when I sat down and I made this list of all the things I hope to happen out of my podcast, suicide prevention was not on my radar at all, right? Like nobody thinks that. I had a little girl in a village in India email me, and so I don't know how she found the podcast, but she's like, we don't always have water here, but I don't know if it was Microsoft or Google, somebody gave them all like these kind of crank solar power laptops and free Wi-Fi that gets beamed down. I don't know how. So they always have Wi-Fi. They don't always have water. And she said that my podcast, inspired her to want to get out of her village and go to college and then come back and like help her village. And so I think there's some measure of just faith in the universe that when you put good out, there are going to be those ripple effects. So that's how I would answer that question. Is that I don't always know, but I don't know that I have to. Just know if I keep doing what I'm doing, eventually I'm going to help a lot of people.
Thank you for sharing those stories. We actually have a question from someone in the audience right now. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Vaibhav.
Awesome. Hi. Really appreciate your time here, and I think your TED Talk and getting to know you really resonates with me a lot. And I think you speak a lot about values and searching for those values. And I understand that the car accident sort of galvanized that process for you. But what was that specific process of searching for what ideals were core to you and essential to you, and how do you translate that, through the vehicle of altruism?
That's a really good question. As I mentioned in my talk, it would have been a really cool story if, like, the accident happened and I'm in the hospital and I balled up my fist and it's like, from this day moment, I'm just going to do kind things for the rest of my life. I didn't have a clue. But I also didn't have any mentorship in the sense of, how do I find that? One of the things that is so important is having people in your life to guide you. And I had like great parents, and my parents are kind and humble people. So it isn't like I had bad examples in my home. But for me, it was just this process of essentially hitting rock bottom and not knowing what to do next. And then it was, okay, so for me, it was experience connecting with being able to better identify values. So I had the experience of going to that school's PTA and talking to all those parents and giving them help about internet safety for those kids. That experience was like, oh, well, this feels really, really good. And how can I feel good more? And then as I kept doing those things, I started connecting the dots backwards and saying, okay, so one of the values for me is selflessness, is giving, is educating. And so I did it backwards. It would be much easier for me. It probably would have been much less painful for me if I had done what I mentioned to you guys 10 minutes ago. If I had sat down after that accident with a pen and paper and didn't let myself get up from the table until I was very clear on what values were important to me, then I think I wouldn't have felt as lost as I did for as long as I did, because I had that disconnect. I didn't have a sense of purpose, and I wasn't clear on what was really important to me. All I knew is that I had no idea what I was supposed to do with my life. And so so I did it the opposite way that I mentioned to you guys, and it took me years to do it, but I was able to eventually figure out, okay, so it's altruism, kindness, helping other people. Like, that's what fires me up. That's what gets me excited and, really, really jazzed up to start my day. I didn't know that right away, and it took me a while to get there. So again, like, if you did it the opposite way, if you guys started now, I was in college, I was an idiot. It was Mario Kart with my friends, and it was football, and just like, I was not focused on what I'm supposed to be doing in societal impact. But then again, my generation didn't do that stuff back then. You guys today, I know I sound old as I say that, you guys are much more insightful as a generation today than my generation was by a million light years. Did that answer your question? Was that helpful?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you for your question, Vaibhav. Yeah, I think that was a really great answer and just a helpful reminder that values can be a really great anchor to kind of find your purpose. I'm going to pass it back to Serene for another question we have from the audience.
Yeah, awesome. We have a question coming from Danny, and he's asking, do you find that there are people who decide to selectively help the people who are helping people?
Ask that second part again. Do I find that there are, and thank you for the question, Danny, do I find that there are people that are choosing to selectively help? Is that the question?
I think his question is, do you find that there are people who decide to selectively help people that are already helping other people? Like, it becomes a cycle.
I don't have any science to support that, but, well, I kind of do, actually, in an indirect way. We have these things in our brains called mirror neurons. And what mirror neurons do is they basically kind of align us with other people and other things in our environment. So our brains and our bodies are basically wired for sameness. And the term is homeostasis. It's like your thermostat, right? The thermostat is trying to keep your dorm room at exactly 72 degrees. And it really doesn't like deviate up or down from that. And our brains are the same way. And so when people start making radical changes, they get uncomfortable. And that's why, with mirror neurons, it's why, like, if you took any two people, a great example is if you took two people and put them on a subway, and maybe they make eye contact, maybe don't, but almost assuredly they're not going to have any communication with each other. Versus if you took those two same people and put them in the same sports jersey, all of a sudden now there's a commonality and there's sameness and familiarity, and they'll subconsciously feel more comfortable with each other. So to bring that back to Danny's question, I think when you put yourself in a mindset and then begin acting on that mindset of, I want to live a life where I do altruistic things for other people, by default, you're going to find people that's going to bring you into the lives of others who do the same thing. There's a quote that's often said, it's funny, it's on almost every personal development podcast by a guy by the name of Jim Rohn, who said, you're the average of the 5 people you hang out with the most. And Dale Carnegie talked about this in the 1930s, as did Napoleon Hill. And so these guys they didn't have MRIs and couldn't look at the brain, but what they knew was that you're going to become what you surround yourself with. So if you surround yourself with 5 people who are in the habit of choosing to help others, you're going to become the 6th by default. So I guess there is science. There was science to that question, Danny. But yes, so the answer is yes. Like if you have the mindset that you want to start doing it, you're going to seek out opportunities and experiences that bring those others into your life that do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely tells on how important it is to surround yourself with others that not only support you, but also help you become the best version of yourself, as you've mentioned. So we have another question from the audience members from Macy, and it is, where do you draw the line in terms of performing acts of kindness for someone who simply won't accept it or is stubborn about change?
I want to be careful with this one, Macy. This is a really awesome question, but there's that kind of sounded like a bit of a loaded question to me, in that doing something kind for somebody else to get them to change their ways in some area that that you think they're in trouble. Maybe it's drinking, or maybe a relationship that's wrong for them, whatever it is. So if it's from the scientific definition of altruism, an altruistic act is just simply doing something for somebody else expecting nothing in return, period. Like, that's where the train stops with that. So if you're doing something for somebody hoping that it'll make them change something about them that you don't like, or something that even maybe they know that they need to change about themselves but they're not ready to do, I would question whether that's actually, it's not that it's not an altruistic act. It's not that you're not doing it for their own good, because you are, but there's kind of there's another motive to that, right? Like, you're trying to, in that individual's instance, trying to do something to get them to change a behavior that makes you uncomfortable in some way. And so, what I tell people is just do and expect nothing in return. Because a lot of times, maybe the altruistic act, Macy, is that you're trying to open somebody's eyes that's really important to you to something that's wrong in their life, something that they're doing that's a problem. And maybe they're just not ready to hear that yet. But I guarantee you that if you do it and then let them know how stubborn they are, they're 100% not going to hear it. We as human beings don't make behavioral change until we feel a degree of pain to where then we can't bear that pain anymore. There's plenty of people who know they need to lose weight, and they get on the scale and they see it's a number that they don't like, and then they go straight to McDonald's, right? So knowledge isn't enough. It's knowledge plus pain or fear in many instances that makes us shift our behavior. So I would say hang in there, keep doing your kind things, but don't get upset, or don't try and put pressure on yourself or others to try and have that act transform into some kind of a significant change for somebody else. It's got to happen naturally.
I think that's great advice, and I think that's something that all of us need a reminder of, or all of us need to hear, that there's a fine line between wanting to help someone and then ultimately wanting to change their behavior without them wanting to change it for themselves. So that's great. We have a question from an audience member, Victor. So I'm just going to unmute him and have him ask the question.
Great.
Hey, Doctor.
Hey, Victor.
I got from your talk that being altruistic means providing value to people's lives selflessly. And you were able to do that through talking your expertise to the PTA meeting. Does having a developed competency like your knowledge and security help in being more altruistic?
That's a really good question. I would say no. You don't have to have any. I would make the argument that an individual who doesn't know how to read and write can still do kind things for other people. And so certainly as it relates to the capacity to go and speak to a PTA about internet safety, having a background in network security was a bonus, right? It got me to the table. But I would say, just at a human nature, specific competencies or skills in a craft or an area of expertise isn't really necessary. And we're all capable of caring for other people, regardless of what our level of education or experiences are.
Another question that we had from an audience member, Parisa wanted to know what your thoughts are on true altruism versus egoism. And so kind of whether our actions that benefit others truly for the other person's good or ultimately to make yourself feel better.
There's been a good amount of science. This is a great question. I love this question. There has been a lot of research on this because you always hear the expression pay it forward, right? Like if you do something good for somebody else, the universe is, if you give somebody $20, one day the universe is going to magically give you 50, right? It's really two questions. One, is it altruistic if you're doing something kind for somebody else with a motivation of selfishness that you're going to get something back in return? That's number one. And number two, if you are doing that, are you still doing good? So I think the answer to number two is yes. If you're handing out food to homeless people, you're still helping homeless people, right? Now, from a pure scientific standpoint, is it really altruism if you have a selfish motive? Not really, but I would argue that I would rather have, using the example of the people feeding first responders, I would rather have 1,000 people feeding first responders or raising money. Like there's a charity that I just got connected with that provides college scholarships for families where a first responder has died. Even if somebody was expecting something in return, like universally, I'm okay with those people giving money to help some kid go to college one day that wouldn't have had that chance otherwise. So they're still doing good in the world. Is it technically altruism? Not by the letter of the definition, but that doesn't mean that it can be discounted. And then the other thing that happens with this, it's kind of like the FBI agents who go undercover into cults and then eventually get sucked into the cult over time, is that you can go into it kind of thinking, oh, well, I'm going to do something hoping I get something back out of it. But again, the more you engage in the behavior, the more those neurotropics or those endorphins and neurotransmitters. Wow. As those neurotransmitters are released, you're going to get those positive feelings. So it's very possible that even if you start doing kind acts, hoping to get something in return, that over time, you will find that you just start doing kind acts because it feels good. And, whether something else happens to you and then that substantiates that belief, it's almost immaterial at that point. But again, you're still doing good in the world. Good question.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction to make, but that regardless, the good that you do is still good and positive for the community that you're in. So we've got another question from the audience from Ayushi, and she's asking, we have been talking about helping, but given a large group, the bystander effect comes to play. How can us bystanders overcome that reluctance and help?
By overcoming the reluctance to help. The bystander effect is very well known, of course. The most famous case of this is the woman who was killed outside her apartment, screaming for help, and neighbors heard her, but nobody did anything. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is the knowledge that one person can make a difference. And sometimes we don't think that that one voice, that one act can make a difference, but it can't, but it does. And so if your focus is, I want to make a difference when I can make a difference, and how I can make impact, how I can have impact, then I would say the bystander effect isn't really applicable, because you're taking a conscious action to do something good and to stand up and do what's right, regardless of what everybody else does.
I'm sad that we kind of have to wrap up soon, but another question that we received from Todd was referring back to one of his last statements, the newer generations being more open-minded / understanding than previous ones. Where do you think we can improve as a society and culture with the way that we think?
And you know, as a member of one of those older generations, you know, just hanging out there in Gen X, so I know that my peers think very differently than you guys. I think what would be really helpful is, you know, rather than just saying, well, boomers suck because they're all about money, is to understand that fundamentally we're all human beings, and it's really helpful and important that we understand the differences between us, because, you know, if you guys were brought up in an environment where it's important to care about the world, whereas there are people who are kind of in that corporate world and nearing the end of their run, I guess, from an age standpoint, who are brought up in an era that, you know, you go to work and you come home and the wife stays home and cooks dinner. Like, we know that's ridiculous today, right? Like, that's just not the way that it is. But I can't remember what episode it was. I wish I knew off the top of my head. I had a woman on my show who works with businesses like Fortune 500 companies, and she helps millennials understand Gen Xers and boomers understand millennials, and that there are, you know, the ways that everybody can play together. So I guess that's the most important thing, is that, you know, whether we agree with the person across the hall from us, we still have to share the world with them, right? And so wouldn't it be better if we could find common ground rather than finding ways to be mistrusting of each other?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great point. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. So I think I have a question that I don't think I'm only speaking for myself, but for a couple of people in the audience and on the team as well, who are pursuing either cognitive science or psychology majors. I know that you pursued your PhD in clinical psych, and I guess, do you have any advice for us in pursuing that, or pursuing your master's as well?
Yeah, a few things. The first thing I would say is be very clear on why you're pursuing that degree. I remember when I was in undergrad and I had to go change my major. I was a history major at one point, believe it or not. And I'm sitting next to this guy, and he was becoming pre-med. And I said, why are you becoming pre-med? And he said, my dad told me that I'm going to be a doctor. And he just looked miserable. And to be like 19 and have the life sucked out of your soul because somebody's making you do something is horrible. So if you're going into the behavioral sciences, go into it because it excites you like nothing else. Go into it because the idea of having a positive impact in people's lives is thrilling to you. Make sure it's for the right reasons. Don't go into it thinking because you're going to make X number of dollars or because you're going to impress, you know, your parents or something like that. So that's the first advice. And so all of you are in undergrad, so that's good. So, you know, you have time to evaluate that. The other things that I would tell you, I mean, everyone's going to tell you, oh, go do research, and, you know, that's all true. That all helps, of course. But when I was in my doctoral program and I was doing one of my diagnostic practica experiences at Grady Memorial Hospital here in Atlanta, it was a bit, that workload is overwhelming a little bit. And then you have, you know, competency exams, all these things, and balancing it was very difficult. And the supervisor at the time, who was himself a postdoctoral resident, said to me, the best advice anybody ever told me was just to remember this one statement: the work will always get done And I kind of cocked my head a little bit like a puppy that heard something he thinks he understood, but didn't quite all the way understand. And I asked him to clarify, and what he meant by that was that whatever deadlines are arbitrarily in place for you with projects and assignments and reports and everything else, like, you're going to find a way no matter what to get the work done. But it's okay to shut the laptop screen now and again and relax a little bit, because it's very easy to get so tunnel vision into our schoolwork that we lose track of life and what's important to us.
That's really great advice for students especially. Well, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We were all extremely moved and inspired by all your insights, and I'm sad that this has to end, but will you let everyone know kind of like where else they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I've really enjoyed this as well. And you guys asked some really phenomenal questions. So thank you for those, especially the ones that had to make me think a little bit. I appreciate those the most. So if you just, kind of my mothership is drrichardshuster.com, and you can spell it any way you want because I bought every imaginable domain combination for that. And if you want to check out my podcast, that's at thedailyhelping.com. And so, that's a platform where sometimes I interview people about physical health, and sometimes it's about emotional health. I just have these varied topics, but all of the kind of core commonality with everybody I bring on my show is that everybody who comes on wants to leverage their expertise to make the world a better place. That's my criteria. So, really, really happy to, connect with you guys and hope that this was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
Thank
we
you
also
so much.
we also wanted to let everybody know that our next Q&A will be at 2 p.m. with Rose. And check out all of our activities and talks in our dashboard. We've linked it in the chat. And thank you again so much, Dr. Richard, for being here.
It was my honor. Thank you.